This Week in Virology, the podcast about viruses, the kind that make you sick. From Microbe TV, this is TWiV, This Week in Virology, a special episode recorded on March 17th, 2020. I'm Vincent and you're listening to the podcast all about viruses. We are continuing our special analysis of the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2. And my guest, a very special guest, he has not been back on TWiV for a long time, but he was here in the early days. He is a professor of epidemiology here at Columbia University Medical Center, director of the Infectious Disease Epidemiology Certificate Program, one of the original founders of Promet Mail, and he coined the term emerging infection. Steve Morse, welcome to TWiV.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
You were here in the earliest days of TWiV, and I think it was during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic.
Yeah, there always seems to be a pandemic every few years. So there was the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, which some people felt was disappointing. I didn't, but I heard a lot of grumbling afterwards that they'd heard so much about it and it wasn't so bad. But I think that's always the problem. If you prepare, everyone thinks if you do it well, you've over-prepared, and that's exactly what we want. We want the minimum number of illnesses and to make it as relatively painless as possible. It's always going to be a difficult experience for many people. And if you underprepare, then it's very clear. And unfortunately, that happens all too often. So sometimes we try to be prepared, but pandemic influenza, as you know, has been a long-standing concern, going back to the images of the 1918 pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, which is the greatest natural disaster in history. So we all obviously have that very much in mind. It's unique. It's been unique. Hopefully, I will not see it again, at least in my lifetime, and probably, I suspect, in our students' lifetime. But we all know that is like the bubonic plague, the Black Death of the 14th century. It's just one of those epochal events that really affects our thinking, our culture. Of course, that at the time was perhaps overshadowed by World War I, but it killed many more people, essentially young, healthy people who were among the troops sent to World War I. And the Germans still thought that the 1918 pandemic was responsible for their losing the war. Well, whether that's true or not, we do have pandemics, and I'm always sorry that it's a pandemic that brings me back here. It would be, we have the pleasure of seeing each other in between every so often on the Columbia campus and the Biosafety Committee and other things. So,
as you said to me in Washington, we meet in all the same places, right? Yeah,
so that was something that our dear colleague and one of my mentors, Josh Lederberg, said some years ago. We were going to a WHO meeting, and we're checking in at the same hotel in Geneva. And as he came in the door, he said, "Oh, we meet in all the most expected places."
Most expected, yes. Well, I don't want to have you only here for pandemics. We should have you back more often. So I just didn't think of it, but we will do it.
You're busy. There's a lot going on in that microbial world.
There is. And unfortunately, it's all focused on SARS-CoV-2 right now. And, I understand people are concerned. There's a lot else going on out there as well, but let's talk about this. I mean, you and Josh Lederberg coined the term emerging infection, right?
Yeah, emerging viruses, actually. Okay. And then that term got extended, but that has an interesting history because I was at Rockefeller at the time as a young faculty member, had a lab there, and just happened by chance to go to the holiday party, and Josh Lederberg, actually his wife Marguerite, reminded him that he had a question for a virologist and that I was a virologist. And so on the way out the door, he's asked me a few questions about hantaviruses and other things that were on his mind. And that was back in the 1980s, the late 1980s. And, of course, Josh was always asking what seemed to be innocent questions until you actually thought about them and you realized that, like the famous metaphor of the onion, you're always peeling another layer off until, I don't know if you ever get to the heart of it, but there's always, more and more profundity that is wrapped in what seems to be a simple question. So Josh simply asked me some questions that got me thinking about viruses, the risk of viruses, and then what I called emerging viruses, because they seem to come out of nowhere. They emerge. And of course, HIV was then the prime example. It was a few years after that. And in 1989, we had a conference with John LaMontagne at NIAID, National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and another late lamented, very dear colleague. He took up the challenge. I went to talk to him about doing a conference on emerging viruses because Josh had encouraged me with some questions, and I wrote him back, and he wrote me a memo saying the problem of emerging viruses is one that needs to be dealt with at the highest levels. And of course, being an assistant professor, I was too naive to realize he meant that quite literally, like the White House, and levels like that. So I went off and I became really, concerned about this question, and with that encouragement thought that this would be an interesting and important question to try to solve, and a tough question. We like solving mysteries, So eventually I was directed to John LaMontagne, and we talked about developing a conference on emerging viruses, which was held in 1989.
Right.
And in retrospect, seemed, nobody knew what to expect because it was really uncharted territory, just like our experience with these coronaviruses.
So yes, I remember there was a paper out of that meeting, right?
There was in the Journal of Infectious Diseases. Right. And of course, eventually I adapted some of that into a book.
Which you should revise, by the way. I know you don't want to do it, but I have one here, Emerging Viruses.
Thank you. No, I want to do it. That book any book is a labor of love, sure, I think, sure. and takes a tremendous amount of dedication.
But as I told you, I was recently revising the Emerging Viruses chapter in our textbook, and I pulled it out, and it's still very relevant. A lot of the concepts are still applied, and in fact, it's full of some of the giants in the field talking about their own, some of the people I've interviewed, like Jim LeDuc, at Galveston and so forth. It's really wonderful.
And Josh Lederberg,
that's right.
Contributed a chapter, which is actually interesting because it's thought-provoking and has the usual Josh Lederberg aphorisms, some really interesting aphorisms that I think, like, mankind is to a large extent a man-made species, by which he means that we have evolutionary constraints. We have risen to some evolutionary level, but much of what we've been able to do is the result of clothing, technology, our being able to find ways to feed ourselves and protect ourselves against the weather and improve the environment, at least, until recently, to have better water and safer situations. So it's also true that many of the emerging viruses and many of the emerging infections, it turns out, in a sense, are also, they come from nature, as we found out, after thinking about many of the possible sources, but human beings play a very big role in introducing them into the human population and allowing them or helping them to spread and gain a foothold.
And we see that more and more as population increases, mobility, communication, all of this is playing into it. But I think from our earliest days as hunter-gatherers, we probably got infections when we went out into the field, right?
Undoubtedly, and there's a lot of speculation about, tuberculosis. Was that originally when we started agriculture, we picked up a few things that eventually got domesticated like the livestock, but became domesticated as human viruses.
That's right.
Like, did tuberculosis, not a virus, but a bacterium, of course, come from bovine tuberculosis, right. Or did some of these other viruses, measles, that's strictly a human virus, which is why we can think about the possibility someday of eradicating it if everyone could only get immunized appropriately. Smallpox and some of these others that are specialized for humans, could they have relatives in other species in nature? So did they come first from the wild, from wildlife as hunter-gatherers, and then perhaps later when we clustered into agricultural communities from our livestock, perhaps getting it as an intermediary?
So we mentioned earlier Promet Mail, and I just want to say promedmail.org has been my go-to source for information throughout this. Do you still look at it on a regular basis?
Thank you. I do, and it's now 25 years old. And interestingly, the technology, one of the things that probably is most in my book that is probably most out of date is the technology. There are some other things, but the technology has changed in ways we could never have imagined. So when we started Promet Mail in really 25 years ago, the idea was really to find a way to network all of these labs around the world, and all these facilities and scientists all around the world who are members of this loose network we put together called ProMed, the Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases. And it was another virologist. I don't want to drop names, but I'm sure the name will be familiar to many of your listeners, Bob Shope, who did a lot of pioneering work on dengue, among other things, and arthropod-borne viruses. Bob Shope actually just came up with the name, sort of off the top of his head. He was amazing, and, amazingly quick, as well as a very nice man, but and a great scientist. But Bob came up with the name Program for Monitoring Emerging Diseases, and the original idea was to actually bring together scientists and facilities from around the world to try to improve our surveillance and identification of new infections, because at that time the World Health Organization was not really interested. It's gotten a lot better since then, but it's had its ups and downs. And then we discovered that no one had a way to communicate with each other. There were various methods of communication, but of course, with differences in time zones and differences in what they could use to communicate. Some people had telephones. In Russia, they had fax, but no fax paper. In Francis Nkrumah in Ghana, at the Noguchi Memorial Institute, then an excellent place, he had to be reached by telex, a method that probably most of the listeners don't even remember, but I had to go downtown to send a telex. It's sort of like a telegram. So at some point, it was actually Josh Lederberg, an early adopter of all technologies, I might add, who suggested email and kind of shamed me into it. And we got everyone on email, which in those days seems like a trivial feat today, but in those days, there was no World Wide Web. It was just a couple of pages in the basement of CERN, the nuclear research facility in Geneva. Maybe it wasn't in the basement, but that's what I heard. And, it was really just a demonstration. It's grown so much in recent years. So we tried to link everyone up by email. In some cases, that required teaming up with another nonprofit organization that did satellite uplinks, and actually you could do store and forward email. They would pass over every place for about a half hour twice a day. And so places remotely in Africa could send up emails and get replies back during that short period. How the world has changed. We felt lucky if we can get an email in 2 days. And it took about that long to format one and send it out. But since then, of course, the whole technology has grown. I'm sorry to say that probably our given our evolution and the fact that we are, as Josh Lederberg said, to a large extent, a man-made species with all of these technological and other advancements, I'm afraid we have greater ability than ever to deal with these infections and to deal with these crises, but unfortunately, the same human nature, which in many ways is wonderful, but also can be very self-defeating, is at play here, as we see in the spread of the coronavirus, as we saw with other pandemics. But to get back briefly to Promet Mail, it took on a life of its own. At one point, a couple of us, Jack Woodall, and also, I'm sorry to say, no longer with us, Barbara Rosenberg, who was actually interested in trying to find ways to improve the bioweapons treaty, the BWC. So that was interesting. But and myself, Jack and I were sort of the hands-on people, so volunteering to run this, at that time, small system. And then we realized that we could make it available to anyone once more and more people got email. It should be a resource, and it became a resource for anyone who wants to get it. And that's been 25 years. So it's still using the most basic email you can imagine, because that is a legacy perhaps from the period. But we also want people who are living in remote areas and have very little bandwidth to be able to get this information and contribute. That was the original idea, and it remains the commitment. It is an organization with a real sense of mission. Although I haven't been really hands-on with it for a number of years. Since I spent a few years in government, I felt wouldn't be appropriate at that time. Nevertheless, I think that organization, the Promet Mail, has really grown in a number of ways, very gratifyingly, but I think it maintains still that same sense of purpose. No ads, and try to be as unbiased as possible. Everything is free. You can subscribe free, or you can go on the web and get it in a slightly more graphically friendly format.
Yeah, I would highly recommend it to listeners, prometmail.org. And you can hear about all kinds of outbreaks, not just SARS-CoV-2, but everything. You can subscribe to a broad swath, and you can really keep up. I get these emails about plant diseases regularly, right?
That was one of the things. Actually, it was Ruth Berkelman, who was then deputy director of the CDC's National Center for Infectious Diseases, who thought that we should, even though she's an MD and a person who's most interested in human disease, she was a very big advocate, as were a number of others. We all believe plant diseases should be there. And she was a very strong advocate for making sure we included that. We also used the One Health approach. So the human and other animal diseases, if you will, diseases of other animal species, are basically on the same lists. And if you want to read about the human diseases, you have to find out about the animal diseases, largely because many of them are of importance to us, either economically or, as we see here, because they're of zoonotic origin. So we need to keep an eye on them.
So let's turn to the current pandemic. I just read a paper which said the last true pandemic without a vaccine was 1918. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it depends on your definition of pandemic, but it is true that in 1918, of course, we had very little knowledge of what was even causing it. We thought it might be bacterial, and people were looking for the bacterium that caused the flu. It wasn't until the 30s that people actually recognized the first animal model was developed in 1933 by Christopher Andrews and colleagues in the ferret, still used today and still one of the best animal models. And even though people knew about viruses before then, no one really could handle them very well, grow them or identify them. And yes, I think it's an interesting statement because in 1918, we didn't have a vaccine. And around the time of the Second World War and the post-war period, flu vaccines became available. Mm-hmm. Although in the 57 and even the 68 pandemics, the next two flu pandemics that are officially recognized since 1918, flu vaccine was not much encouraged. There wasn't a lot of uptake of the vaccine. The supplies were probably very limited. And so many doctors refused to give it or didn't want to give it to their patients. And CDC, in fact, was rather ambivalent. I think about using it. So we've kind of vacillated there, but I think we now recognize that flu vaccine is a very important tool in trying to control influenza. Imperfect, but, one of many tools in the toolbox and a very important one. And maybe it'll get better. There's a release right now from National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, just today, I think, announcing that there's some further progress in developing the so-called universal flu vaccine, one that will protect us against not just one or two of the circulating strains that we need to identify in advance, but perhaps a broader variety, including some we haven't recognized yet, but that might come about. And that would be a wonderful thing to have. But I think it's an interesting point. That was the first and the last pandemic of 1918 without a flu vaccine, but it still is not as widely used as it could be. Yeah.
So the article that quoted that is a modeling study saying if we don't do drastic restriction of movement, we're going to have a more serious outbreak. And they mentioned that in 1918 there were a number of non-pharmaceutical interventions attempted, isolation of people, which some cities did and some cities didn't, and we can look back at the data and see that they can have an effect on an outbreak that large.
They do have an effect, although, as Howard Markle, the historian, noted, the places that actually completely escaped it were either so remote that nobody essentially went there. Sometimes they'd get it 2 years later, like parts of New Guinea, or that had, like a town called Littleton, Colorado, decided essentially to block themselves off from all contact with the rest of humanity. And so the trains were not allowed to stop there, and anyone who left the town was not allowed to come back. Wow. And they never did get it, but most places did. The more remote places, obviously, of which there are fewer and fewer today, had less of it, or some had very little. On the other hand, the question of non-pharmaceutical interventions is a very important one. That was really all that was available in 1918. And those were the same precautions in various ways that have been modified and adapted over the years for every flu pandemic, although some of them have been more forcefully applied than others. Mm-hmm. And we're using the same measures now with the coronavirus.
From what I remember from 2009 and less so from 1968, there weren't really major restrictions on movements. Schools were not closed. Is that correct? If I'm remembering correctly?
It's actually very interesting because there wasn't that much restriction on movement. Mm-hmm. And most people in public health tend to be against travel restrictions because usually the feeling is that by time you notice that you have a problem, it's already too late. So travel restrictions have little value unless you can get it really early. And they rarely, are that targeted. By then people have traveled. Even in the current situation, that's a problem because there was already quite a bit of travel, not just from Wuhan where it started to other places in China, but also outside of China. Who knew that Wuhan had so many direct flights every day? But it's a city of 11 million people, and there are people who had come to the U.S., to Europe, to other parts of Asia before anyone recognized what the problem was. So travel restrictions were not much used during other flu pandemics. Even in 1918, we saw, Littleton, Colorado, a few places that did it locally. School closures were largely a local matter. In 1918, for example, New York City decided to keep the schools open and to use it for educational purposes. We know from work that had been done in the 2009 pandemic, there was a study published in Clinical Infectious Diseases, that journal, about two towns or two cities in Texas that did two opposite things. One kept the schools open, because closing a school is a hard decision, and then deciding when to reopen it is even harder. It's really hard to know when it's really over. And then another town closed their schools, and they were able to compare these. You don't often have these natural experiments that are essentially like case control studies or randomized trials. But in this case, they did, and they were able to show that there was perhaps a 50% reduction, perhaps a bit more, by closing the schools. But that has to be done early. If you don't do it early enough, it's already spread too far. And many of these interventions are instituted. Often they're started too late to really have their maximal effect. But we're still trying to understand, how to get the biggest effect out of these interventions without disrupting life more than necessary.
You think it's too late here in New York to close the schools? They just closed yesterday, right?
Yeah. I think it's, and it was a difficult decision, because schools today are serving many functions, and we have many two-parent families where both parents are working. So, now they're staying home, presumably, if they're able to get sick leave or able to work from home, and they're taking care of their kids. But for many people, the schools provide not only essentially a form of daycare, if you will, with education, but also food for the kids who are not as well nourished, and get nutrition, other activities that essentially, enrich the children's or the students' lives, but also keep them occupied while their parents are still at work. So, it was a hard decision, and that was much debated. I was involved in some of those discussions during earlier pandemic planning, about 2007, believe it or not, before the 2009 pandemic. We didn't know it was coming, but we knew something was bound to come, so there was planning. And basically, the playbook developed then is what we're using right now. Closing the schools, I think, was probably a wise decision. If nothing else, there was such a strong political clamor to do it that I think that it would have been hard, not to, even if you could make scientific arguments for and against. But I think if you're going to do it, you should do it early. But that means keeping them closed for quite a while, because you don't know when it's safe to open them again.
How will we know if closing the schools had any effect on the outbreak?
We probably won't, and we probably won't know, what has had an effect on the outbreak, except that we have the experience of other places, such as China, where they did a number of different interventions, or Italy, or on the more positive side, perhaps Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, which had a serious problem initially for unforeseen reasons, having to do with a religious group that apparently was spreading it. But South Korea got it under control, quite effectively. And those perhaps are examples we can learn from. But we've also learned from some of the interventions in China, which suggests that some of the non-pharmaceutical interventions we're doing right now will be helpful. But China found that it reduced transmission probably by perhaps 50 to 60%, which is significant. But they still had transmission because you had family clusters when people stayed home. So it's probably good in that sense to close the schools, because you will reduce the chance of the children becoming infected and bringing it home. But what happens in the family clusters is then a family member may go out, not feeling sick at all, as most of the younger people do, and as most of the people who get this coronavirus do. So they would go out and be able to pass it on to others if they're infected. And that's why it wasn't possible to completely eliminate it, but certainly it made a tremendous dent in the transmission.
What do you think the level of population immunity in China is now, just in these quarantined areas? Because I understand it was only certain areas quarantined. In fact, most of the population was not, right?
That's correct. It was in cities where they had identified the virus, actually cases, which are, according to China's own estimates, probably about 14 or 15% of all of the infections were, which they could determine by testing, and the infections were mostly mild or asymptomatic without any apparent clinical signs. About 15%, 14% was the figure they gave a few weeks ago, were thought to be severe, meaning that they were serious enough to require medical attention, and therefore, they would come to medical notice. The rest of them were probably not really being identified. They were largely identified because of the traditional epidemiological practice, the traditional public health practice of contact tracing, where you find a case and then try to identify by talking to them and finding lists of other people they may have been in contact with at the same time, try to find their contacts, people who they may have been in the same room with or on the same plane with or in whatever, and then follow up on them to see if they're sick. Then they would need medical attention, but especially that's usually the group you're going to target for testing. And you often find when you do that there are a large number of people who really weren't very sick or maybe weren't even aware of being sick. And you can find a positive test, so you know that that's the hidden population, if you will. The cliche is the severe cases are the tip of the iceberg. And, I like to take out a dollar bill at this point and can't do this on the radio, point to the pyramid on the back, which is a Masonic symbol, right. Mystical symbol. But the top of that, if you will, looks like it's bathed in rays of sunlight, but I think it's actually bathed probably in virus or maybe ICU care. So those people are the proverbial tip of the iceberg or the tip of the pyramid who require clinical care. And that seems to be about 14, 15%. And then the rest are varying levels of illness, but most at the bottom of the pyramid, essentially. And this seems to be holding here, don't seem to be very severely affected, if at all. And so they're unfortunately able to transmit to others without unknowingly or unwittingly until the virus finally hits somebody who is vulnerable and gets sick. And then we find out about a case, as we call it.
So I understand that life is starting to return to normal in China in these areas. Do you think the outbreak is over, or do you think there'll be more in the coming weeks?
I don't think we really know. And the possibility is always the outbreak is going in many other countries of the world. So, Italy and much of Europe seems to be going through an experience similar to what we saw in some parts of China. And it's obviously they're trying to repeat some of the same measures, but they're very hard to do simply because, China has a centralized system where they can deploy resources nationally. And also where they can expect to some degree, I think there's been some resistance now for the first time, but to some degree expect compliance from most of the population. So, this is something we would not normally accept. But one of the ironies is that as it's going around the world, and China has at least Wuhan has probably a fairly high level at this point of resistance. And I'm not quite, that is, of people who are who have recovered and are immune. We don't know how many they actually are. But if it were, let's say, 60 or 70%, that would probably be enough to protect the population based on the transmissibility, the so-called herd immunity effect. And we don't know exactly what the transmissibility is. It seems to be somewhat more than flu, but the herd immunity means that not everyone would necessarily get infected before the epidemic would peter out. You just need some critical number to be immune and not susceptible. But there you might have a high enough level of immunity, but this is going around the world, and there's always the possibility, which I'm not suggesting is going to happen, that it could be reintroduced from somewhere else into China and start all over again in places that have not been as hard hit. So I think we have to remember that the whole world, with a few exceptions, those people who've recovered in Wuhan, remain susceptible to this, just as they do to flu pandemics and others. It's totally unfamiliar to the human population. So China is probably better off at this point, having gone through this ordeal, but they're not. I think they can't completely rest on their laurels. No one can, because there are still enough susceptible people in much of the world.
Yeah. So China, over a 2-month period with really restrictive movement regulations, have reported about 81,000 cases. And Italy is rapidly creeping up on that with just a moderate amount of restriction of movement in the Lombardy area, right? So the question is, what do we have to do here? Here, there are no movement restrictions. Although schools are closed, big events are closed, restaurants here in the city. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the country. What's your sense of the extent of restrictions, and what do you think we have to do that we haven't done yet?
Well, I think there's a big testing gap, and I think, that's a real problem. I know that our testing capacity is really very limited and has been limited. And it's unfortunate we really didn't take the time. We could have seen 2003 with SARS and the first coronavirus coming from an animal reservoir, usually a bat in this case, a little horseshoe bat in the live animal markets. And ironically, it's the same source of many. Our colleagues went out and found many SARS-like viruses and closely related viruses in the same bats in the same area. So, it was only a matter of time before another one, if not SARS itself, something very much like it, would get into the human population. So that, and then of course with MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, on a different branch of the coronavirus family tree, but behaving very similarly to SARS, then appeared in about 2012 in the Middle East. So we perhaps were a little complacent about that because we knew that there were a lot of coronaviruses very similar to SARS, just waiting for their opportunity. Perhaps we didn't anticipate that any of them would have the ability to spread so well from person to person. But we should have thought of that as a possibility because there was nothing, we didn't know how to predict what would and what wouldn't at that point. And we could have taken advantage of that to be further ahead. We could have taken advantage in the nearer term of what was going on in China to develop more diagnostics and a better plan using essentially our original pandemic plans to think about, how we were going to implement some kind of protective measures, how we were going to test, how we were going to build lab capacity for testing, and of course capacity for dealing with the perhaps 15% of people who needed medical attention. So we're improvising all of that as we go along. And as we can see in Italy, they've had a very hard time because they simply do not have the capacity to handle the large number of patients that they have. And in the U.S., it's a bigger place, but we also have a bigger population. So, it's going to require a lot of catching up.
Do you think, so San Francisco is in lockdown?
They are.
Do you think every major city in the U.S. will do that? I have no sense. I cannot tell. I hear rumors. I'd like to hear from you.
I don't know either, because, all of the actions that have been taken, some of the travel restrictions, for example, from other countries, seem to have been rather sudden. You might hear a rumor of it a day or two before. And of course, it has a symbolic value. So, the politicians like to do that. I hate to lump them together. They like to do things so that C.P. Snow, the novelist, said at one point in one of his books, justice must not only be done, but it must be seen to be done. So the politicians like, of course, that it be seen. And sometimes that's more important, in giving people the right perception, and perception is very important. And so how we provide reliable messages to people also is very important. But to get back to the question of travel, I don't know. I think at this point, most of the countries that are on the list, we started with China and then had to add several other Asian countries, Hong Kong. Then we had to add Italy and Iran, where they have an ongoing severe outbreak as well. And we keep adding countries to the list. But I think we can't do that indefinitely, because essentially it's a pandemic. The whole world is more or less affected by it. And those that don't have many cases now will very shortly, I'm afraid, if they aren't able to take immediate measures to stop the spread. And that means finding the infected individuals, not just the sick ones. So will we have more measures? I don't know. I think it depends on how much more it increases, because it has been increasing rapidly in places like New York City. So I think the measures that have been taken here, like closing the schools, similar to what many places did in flu pandemics, seem to be reasonable at this point. Will we do more social distancing, as we call it, requiring people to stay home more? We're encouraging that very strongly. But will we make that more of a requirement? It's really hard to enforce. San Francisco, you think of as a very free living kind of town, now inhabited largely by a lot of people from Silicon Valley, who obviously are not going to take restrictions very well. So it's going to be interesting to see. We have relatives living in the city. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think that that's kind of, in many ways, an act of desperation. Once you do what China had to do, you realize that it's already late in the game. And so you're trying to catch up. At this point, I think we can restrict further spread, hopefully, by doing these home quarantine and social distancing measures, people working from home. And obviously, we need to improve sick leave so that people who are sick and may not have work for employers that have the sick leave policies that they should in this situation, those people should be allowed and required, in fact, encouraged to stay home when they're sick, because it's only going to spread the infection if people come in and work when they're sick. Even if it's only the flu is not trivial. We have people taking up many of our ICU, intensive care unit beds, who have problems from the flu, and they need to be there. And finding additional room for the others who may have some other cause of pneumonia and need ICU will become a serious problem. So we want to prevent that. So anyone who's sick should definitely stay home. If they have family members who are sick, they should stay home. I'm hopeful that will take the edge off it, but we know there's a lot of circulation, and without testing, it's very hard. Nobody really wants to know, I think, how much is really going on. And the testing right now is very resource intensive. So the capacity to do it is too limited to really do the kind of broad testing that Korea did, for example, which helped them to control it because they knew where the infections were before they started seeing cases. Usually by the time you start seeing cases, it's fairly late in the game. So I'm hoping that we can get it under control, but it will take some time to do that. And people being obviously having a sense of purpose. And that's interesting in a sense that for a number of years, we've talked about the political divisions and the ideological divisions in this country. And during wartime, we tend to have a shared sense of purpose and mission. And I'm hopeful that at least we can have, even though it's going to be very unpleasant for all of us to go through this, I'm hoping that we will be able to have that shared sense of purpose and realize we're doing this for each other and pull together to help ourselves, because helping ourselves also helps each other. So we really should think in those broad terms of shared sacrifice and a community effort with that sense of mission. And we really haven't had that for quite a while. And I hope that if one good thing comes out of it, that might be one. There might be some scientific advances also, but, I'm hoping that we'll see some of those scientific advances and not forget, as we did after some of the other outbreaks, and just, let things take their normal course. Because there's been a lot of interest in developing things like rapid point of care, even home tests that could be used more reliably. And that would help a lot to ease the burden on the laboratories. Yeah. And if people could test at home, for example, even if it's not completely reliable, then we wouldn't have to just target certain groups. People would know if they were positive. They would know that they should definitely stay away from others so as not to spread it. And if they're negative, they would know that they should be careful because they could get infected at any time, but at least they would know when they might be able to infect others and take additional precautions of staying home even if they don't feel sick. That would be a great help, and we keep wishing for that, but there's never been the motivation to really push that forward with many of these infectious diseases. Even the rapid flu tests are not good enough. They have too many, they're very good in picking up if they're positive, they're usually quite reliable. So their specificity is superb, but their sensitivity is down around 30%. We need to do much better if we're going to have, reliable testing. But that would be something we would all wish to see. And of course, vaccines and antivirals and other things. So, we hope that'll motivate some of these longer term responses. Who knows?
Can't help but thinking that all of the things that you have said that are happening are kind of measures just added as we're going along instead of having a plan, a pandemic plan. Shouldn't there be a committee, a standing committee in the U.S. that makes plans and prepares us for implementing them?
There should be, and the problem is really the implementation, because we did have pandemic plans. There was one very serious one that is essentially very close to the playbook we're using today, done in 2007. Then the concern was that maybe H5N1, the infamous avian flu, might become a pandemic. I think many of us believe that wasn't going to be the next flu pandemic, but it was good to think of some serious scenarios and what we would do. And that was useful planning. The problem was, of course, following up on it, and there was never much follow-up. So the implementation was a problem. This administration early on had an excellent health security plan, which was came with an accompanying memo signed by the president in his famous Sharpie and his famous spiky signature. It was a good plan in many ways. The problem was implementation never really happened. We know that now because we can see. So there really should be some ongoing implementation, and we should be surveying facilities, surveying what is available in case of an emergency, and making sure they can be made available quickly. And yes, an ongoing group would be a very good thing. We have had ad hoc groups, and there are people right now working in the administration. Bob Kadlec, who's Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Emergency Response, Tony Fauci, of course, who's one of our best scientific communicators, people like Ann Schuchat at CDC and others, who are superb. They've worked with these problems for many years. They've thought about them, and they could do an excellent job, and it's very surprising to me that our federal government has not moved more effectively so far.
So here's a question I get asked often. should we, if they were available, should we wear face masks and N95s?
Yeah, and that's really a hard question because there are pros and cons. One of our colleagues, Ian Lipkin, who was in China and self-quarantined on his way back, he started out, like most of us and like myself, thinking that face masks on balance were not a good idea. And he's become a convert with all the zeal of the converted. So the evidence on that is mixed. But I think the problem with face masks is, besides the fact that people buying them up who don't need them may make them unavailable to those who really do. Those who are infected and people working in healthcare and particularly long-term care settings where you have a lot of vulnerable people. But also the evidence is rather mixed. The real concern, I think, is even if they did some good, and they need to be used properly. People think they want to wear face masks until they actually have to do it. It takes a lot of discipline to do it properly. So I'm really worried about that, and especially with the N95, which is much more effective, but is really a respirator. It carries some serious needs for being able to breathe through them, feeling comfortable, and making sure they fit properly if they're going to work. So those are not surgical masks. There's serious medical equipment. And the reality is people may get a false sense of security and accidentally infect themselves thinking the face masks will protect them. So I think that if people want to use them, it's one thing, but I think they should become informed if they do, because very often people try them and then discover that it really wasn't a good solution. Sometimes they find out too late after they've accidentally infected themselves by touching their face mask and then touching their face. So the false sense of security, as well as the scarcity, is a real worry to me. So if people use them, they should really get instructed in how to use them properly.
Is it true that in China, many people do wear face masks?
Oh, yes. In Asia, it's a much more common thing. And in Japan, we see people wearing face masks. I used to think it was just a sort of a very polite thing to do. If you had a cold or whatever, you wouldn't give it to others. And in fact, if people are infected, they should wear masks to reduce spread to others, because it does cut down on the larger droplets that may be responsible for a lot of the transmission. But it turned out a Japanese colleague told me that very often those face masks are worn to cut down on tree pollen during the allergy season, and it's very good for that. So the Japanese do partly do it to prevent the spread, and the Asian in China and elsewhere partly do it to prevent the spread of infections, but many of them do it just for other reasons, because it prevents them from inhaling other particles from polluted air or pollen.
So do you think a pandemic plan would have, as part of it, having a sufficient supply of face masks and instructing people how to use that? Would that work in this country, you think?
I think that would be difficult. I would like to first see that, we have a population that understands the limitations and the uses of face masks. They could be used, if people were judicious and well informed, but I'm afraid that, again, they could also become sources of infection if people are not careful. So any pandemic plan, however, should identify all of the capacities we have for dealing with various levels of emergency, including social distancing, non-pharmaceutical measures like social distancing, as well as the medical testing and medical care measures, and inventory them, make sure they're available. So there should be an ongoing inventory. And what are your triggers other than sick people coming into the hospital? So you have to have a plan to prevent people from overwhelming the emergency departments and perhaps themselves getting infected if they're not already, or perhaps infecting others if they are. So we really need to work through these issues. Many of them have been thought about. It's the implementation and then deciding what triggers each of those levels. We've looked at various severity levels. So I think it's possible to do it if we're really serious about implementing this on an ongoing basis. And I think that's where the biggest shortcomings have been.
So what are you doing to protect yourself now?
Well, in general, I'm staying at home and working as much as possible from home. I admit that this is an exception, so I'm taking a chance. And there are two of us. My wife is also at home. We both happen to be in the age group of over 60. So, obviously if I get sick, I guess I'll have only myself to blame. But hopefully not. So when I'm out, obviously taking all the other precautions, social distancing, trying to stay 6 feet away, avoid people who are coughing or sneezing. If I cough or sneeze, obviously covering those coughs or sneezes. Hopefully I won't go out if I'm coughing or sneezing. And then washing your hands afterwards. Mm-hmm. And always wash your hands if you touch something that could be contaminated, or if you've covered your coughs and sneezes or gone to the bathroom or about to handle food, but always wash your hands when you've touched something that could be contaminated and before you touch your face, including your eyes, your nose, or your mouth. That's probably the number one thing. Mm-hmm. And then stay away from anyone who might be coughing or sneezing or breathing heavily. And so we generally think 6 feet. It's not going to be perfect, but it should reduce the cases. So I'm taking the same precautions that we've advised people for the flu, basically during flu pandemics. And I'm able to work from home. Not all of us will until, of course, we all go stir crazy. So find things to amuse yourself, because there are mental health issues as well. We expect that a lot of people are going to feel socially isolated, and that's become a real problem, especially in places like long-term care facilities or nursing homes, which are real tinderboxes. We know we have a lot of vulnerable people in very small spaces. We see that during flu outbreaks, even heavy flu years. And the same here. We need to be very careful, to be watchful. And so I'm taking the same precautions that I'm telling everyone else to take, washing my hands. And, basically, I'm not sick yet. So I'm not staying home, but I am staying home all the rest of the time, even though, obviously, I think I'm not sick. If I were, I would, but I'm still staying home most of the time and observing the social distancing. So we're a good 6 feet apart while we're talking.
I appreciate your coming here.
And I appreciate your doing that.
One more question. Where do you see this ending? When is the end? What part of the year and what's happening?
We don't really know. And obviously there are the optimists who are hoping, as we heard from the White House at one point, that it might end with the flu season, since many of these respiratory infections, viral infections, circulate mostly during what we consider the flu season. That's only true in temperate climates, but I think that's really an overly optimistic hope for a variety of reasons. The coronaviruses, for one thing, are a little bit hardier. We've seen them circulating in places like the Middle East, which are hot enough, and we've seen flu pandemics for that matter, and flu is more delicate, we think, than the coronaviruses, occurring during the summer. 2009 was during the late spring and summer.
Right.
1957 was during the summer. So it'd be awfully nice if it ended with the end of the so-called flu season, but I'm not hopeful that it will. So I think we have to be vigilant and continue to be prepared to look out for ourselves and each other. The next thing is maybe it will die down after going through the world. What happens after that? Will we have a vaccine? That might be about a year out, maybe a little bit less. One of the companies says they think they'll have it in November. I'm not sure I'll bet on that. I'm not sure it would work, but we're thinking at least 6 months to a year. That might help. We don't know how long the immunity would last, even with natural infection, but that'd be very helpful, because there are many other possibilities. A coronavirus could circle around the world and then come back in as the flu did, either in waves or in variant form seasonally, or maybe it could just disappear. Perhaps in the long term, it could become domesticated, but I think that's a very long time out. Become domesticated like the other circulating human coronaviruses. But I'm not looking for that anytime soon. So I think we're all learning on the fly, including seeing how this ends. And in the meantime, we have to keep our spirits up and our vigilance.
Because we can't keep locked down forever, obviously. So there has to be a limit. China did it for a couple of months, but it's about the most you can expect, right? Otherwise, countries start to deteriorate.
Yeah, and we've seen that already. Who imagined? We knew that SARS had an effect on the economy. A colleague sent me a picture of the Hong Kong airport during SARS, completely empty,
right.
Except for one traveler who was from the health department, of course. And that's who took the picture, someone else from the health department. But it's worse now. The effect on the economy globally is far worse even than SARS in 2003. And obviously that's a very painful blow that's going to have to at some point be corrected.
I'm sure you're familiar with the Hong Kong travel poster of the time. Hong Kong.
Take your breath away. Yeah. There was an unintended, that was a real irony in retrospect. It was a great double entendre, which they hadn't intended at the time. Sadly, it came true.
My guest today has been Stephen Morse from Columbia University Medical Center. Thank you so much for your wisdom and for risking your health coming here.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be with you and with your listeners.
And come back again, not till the next pandemic, but before.
Oh, I'll look forward to it. Thank you very much.
I'm Vincent Racaniello. You can find me at virology.blog. Thanks to ASV and ASM for their support of TWiV and Ronald Jenkins for the music. This episode of TWiV was recorded, edited, and posted by me, Vincent Racaniello. You've been listening to This Week in Virology. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back next week. Another TWiV is viral.